So this is a short clip of Israel's President Isaac Herzog defending the Israeli response in Gaza after Hamas's attack into Israel about a week and a half ago now. And I'm going to just play it for you first before giving my commentary, and then we'll play it a second time with my commentary. But I think it's very instructive to hear his words, to get an understanding of the Israeli orientation, not just towards war, but also towards the Palestinians.
We are operating militarily according to rules of international law, period. Unequivocally. It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. They could have risen up, they could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat. But we're at war. We are at war. We're at war we are defending our homes. We're protecting our homes. That's the truth. And then when a nation protects its home, it fights. And we will fight until we'll break their backbone.
So I'm going to give my commentary now. And there's just a few fascinating facets here that I think that we should get into.
We are operating militarily according to rules of international law, period.
So that part is obviously untrue. Thus far, we had at least preliminary confirmation, both from Amnesty International as well as Human Rights Watch, that at a bare minimum, for instance, Israel is using white phosphorus in the Gaza Strip. And although white phosphorus in and of itself is not banned, it is specifically banned in the applications that they are using. So, for example, you cannot use white phosphorus, whether it's weapons grade that is specifically targeting whatever, or if it's just supposed to be some sort of smoke screen. In either of these cases, white phosphorus cannot be used in highly densely populated civilian populations, which of course the entirety of the Gaza Strip is exactly that. So putting that aside, shortly before the invasion, tons of Israeli officials started coming out making statements that can be construed both specifically as well as more broadly as an invitation to war crimes, a promise that they were going to commit war crimes. They were saying things like, we are dealing with human animals. There might be some controversy about whether or not that applies to specifically Hamas or the Palestinian people, blah, blah, blah. But it's really irrelevant, right? In the sense that that statement was followed by, since we're dealing with human animals, we're cutting off water, we're cutting off food, we're cutting off fuel, we're cutting off electricity. Then, of course, we're going to force them to do that Mao's Great March all the way to South Gaza under threat of fire, without proper fuel, right? Many people obviously don't have vehicles, nor would they have fuel for those vehicles. Hospitals are rationing fuel. So that is considered a form of collective punishment. And that was telegraphed before it even actually began. You had the UN, you had other human rights groups popping up and saying, this actually does seem like it would be a war crime, but they carry it through. It does seem, in fact, that they've carried out any number of actions that would be construed as war crimes. Just a couple of hours ago, there was recently an attack, it seems to be, from witnesses around there. It seems to be a direct attack on a hospital. I believe it's called the Baptist Hospital in Gaza, which killed I don't know how much it was. It might be as high as a few hundred. It might be somewhere in that ballpark. So don't take it as gospel right now. I'm going to do a little bit more reading on this after this video. But anyway, there's any number of things right now going on that can broadly and specifically be construed as war crimes. So his statement on this thus far is false, and we're just only a couple seconds in.
Unequivocally, it's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. They could have risen up, they could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat.
So just specifically on took over Gaza in a coup d'etat. So Hamas, for those of you that are not aware, it's one of many potentially fundamentalist Islamic organizations in Gaza. And in the 1980s, that was one of the groups, not the only group, but one of the groups that Israel explicitly funded to serve as a counterweight to the PLO, because they actually feared the PLO a lot more than groups like Hamas. This is true kind of like about the whole world. At the time, for instance, America was funding tons of Islamic fundamentalists to serve as a bulwark geopolitically against the USSR. So this is actually nothing new. But it turns out actually that Netanyahu, there's like statements coming out now where it's just direct verbatim quotes where he's saying, if we want to preclude the existence of a Palestinian state, we have to fund Hamas directly. This is more or less a verbatim quote from 2019. This seems to be the Netanyahu policy, honestly, as recently perhaps as a couple of weeks ago. So first of all, there's funding in the 80s. By the time that 2006 rolls around, we have elections. And during one of these elections in 2006, one of the groups that Israel funded 20 years before, one of those groups finally won. So Israel has to bear at least a little bit of responsibility there for Hamas coming into power. But the way that he characterized Hamas coming into power as a coup d'etat, it wasn't a coup d'etat. It was, in fact, a democratic election. Nobody actually, denied the election results. Hillary Clinton did, in fact. She was caught in a hot mic essentially saying we needed to predetermine those election results, and we were not able to do that. So clearly there's this electoral interference sort of thing going on that America always projects outward, accusing other countries of doing the same. Not to say that they don't do the same. Of course they do the same, but we do it too, and much more often, much more frequently, and much worse, simply because we have the capacity to do it, whereas other nations do not. So the way that Hamas came to power, it was actually democratic. Now, the democratic process in Gaza for the past 16 years was just essentially curtailed by the decision to impose, or rather, there was already some sort of blockade going on. I don't remember the specifics, but to really intensify the blockade of Gaza. Because what that meant was Israel was not going to recognize the new Hamas government. I believe most countries in the world did not recognize the new Hamas government. So from Hamas's point of view is, okay, so we did what we were supposed to do, right? All these people after 2001, they're telling us we need to bring democracy to the Middle East. We need to have democracy. This is really the way forward. That sort of cosmopolitan democratic society is really the ideal society. So they have their elections that are not contested, and those results are not respected. From their point of view, this is now essentially going to be, okay, if we're not going to have the democratic process as we were promised, we're going to take this essentially as an act of war. There's going to be militant resistance. That's not to say that they immediately started terrorist attacks against Israel. There were actually many instances of them specifically on their own, by their own volition, just arresting tons of militants because maybe they would have, there could have been some sort of either negotiation or some kind of talk or something happening that they don't want militants to disrupt. And if anybody would get out of line, they actually would do those arrests. That, by the way, ironically enough, there's more arrests that Fatah and Hamas has made of their own militants than you ever had arrests being made by the IDF. Even if you had tons and tons of evidence of war crimes, it's very rare that the IDF would do any kind of arrest or there would be any sort of guilty verdict for some of these crimes. So that part of it is false. But I want to just bring you a little bit to something else that he's saying about all this, which is the idea of collective punishment.
That is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. They could have risen up, they could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat.
So it's funny because he starts this video by essentially saying that Israel is actually complying with all the rules of law and we shouldn't worry. They're actually doing their due diligence and they're trying their best to make sure that they, minimize civilian casualties, so on and so forth. But what he's saying right now, this is what I mean by comments coming out of official, Israeli officials, Israeli government that amount to promises of war crimes. If he's saying that essentially all the residents of Gaza, or most of them, or whatever percentage you want to put on it, if they are more or less culpable for Hamas, therefore we are engaging in these actions against Gaza, that is called collective punishment. That is actually a violation of international law. So as he's saying that we are complying with the law, he's also admitting that we are undertaking actions or a violation of the law. Now, secondarily, I do find it fascinating that he's talking about this so-called uprising. He wants there to be some sort of anti-Hamas uprising. He wants the so-called people to take control away from Hamas. And it's kind of funny to think about, because on the one hand, you have Israelis and you have others that rightly criticize Hamas. For instance, they use child soldiers, right? And the reason why you would have child soldiers in Hamas, like for instance, when you had during that concert attack, witnesses describe like these militants that clearly were 15, 16, 17, 18 years old. And the reason why that is the case is the median age in Gaza is 18. So I want you to really think about what he's saying. He's telling you that this uprising that he wants to see in Gaza, it needs to be undertaken by the people. The median age is 18. That means no matter how you slice it, you're going to get, at a bare minimum, child soldiers. If you want to call an 18-year-old a child, you're going to have 17-year-olds, you're going to have 16-year-olds, you're going to have 15-year-olds, you're going to have 14-year-olds. Now, the weird thing about it is, and people call folks like Isaac Herzog as pragmatists, right? They're moderate in some way. The Palestinians and the Gazans and those in the West Bank, they're never moderate. They're never reasonable, right? They're not pragmatic about their demands. And yet, it seems as if he's under the impression that whatever uprising that might occur in Gaza is going to somehow necessarily be pro-Israel. So he thinks essentially, again, median age of 18, he wants high school seniors to get together, get their boys together, and stage a coup against Hamas. You have a very low level of development in a place like Gaza. This means that the majority of militant movements are always going to have some sort of regressive quality to it. That's going to include the use of child soldiers. That might include things like Islamic fundamentalism, which I don't want to make too big of a deal of, because Palestinians and Israelis, they want to act as if there's really, so much difference between the two, when in fact, Israel is heading so much harder into right-wing territory, into religious extremism. And part of that, I think, is just kind of baked into the system of, if you want to have a Jewish ethno-state, like Israel wants to be, but also you want to like ethnically cleanse everybody around you, and you want to do this forever expansion of Israel into greater Israel, you're going to start accumulating tons of fringe elements, right? You're going to get right-wing nuts. You're going to get fascists. You're going to get militants. You're going to get religious nutzos, right? That's just part of it. Same thing in Gaza. If you make that population totally desperate, if you make that population, if you starve it, they did famously, quote, put Gaza on a diet. They calculated how many calories each person is supposed to consume. They made sure that nothing past that would go past the blockade. And so we're in this situation where you have a country that is, on the one hand, very militaristic and has these ethno-state aspirations, which causes it to turn inward into all these regressive qualities. And you have a desperate area like Gaza, which also has to become bit by bit more regressive. Remember, Palestine used to be, and still is in many respects, the most secular part of the Middle East. If you look at the Palestinian resistance in the 30s and the 40s, you're going to have photos, tons of photos of female soldiers who are actually doing fighting, because it was considered pretty normal, right? In the same way that IDF, right, it often boasts of its own female soldiers and whatnot. I find that part kind of fascinating, right? He is essentially, whether or not he realizes it, this so-called pragmatist is demanding the rise of a child army in Gaza. And although he fancies himself a pragmatist, for whatever reason, he's under the impression that this child army is going to somehow necessarily be pro-Israel. Now, I want to bring your attention to the last part of this video.
But we're at war. We are at war. We're at war we are defending our homes. We're protecting our homes. That's the truth. And then when a nation protects its home, it fights. And we will fight until we'll break their backbone.
So that didn't sound very confident to me. In fact, just looking at some of the images, right, some of the interviews and just like some of the news coming out of not just like this guy, but some of the meetings that you had between American officials and Israeli officials and statements from the EU, all these people that are up here making these kinds of statements, they seem, and this is very new. I haven't noticed this in, like 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I mean, we had siege after siege after siege against Gaza. But for the first time, I'm noticing this anxiety, this nervousness, as if they don't exactly know what to do next, right? They essentially feel humiliated by the Hamas attack into Israel. And they also don't quite know what the next steps to take, because on the one hand, if they just totally ethnically cleanse Gaza, this just kind of proves everything that I've been arguing from the very beginning, what others have been arguing from the very beginning. You start seeing, for instance, like all this stuff on social media where people are like speaking to folks like Samantha Power. You were able to make other humanitarian demands, right? You were able to make other safe passage. You have to absolutely do that for the Gazans so they can make it into Egypt, right? This idea that we need to have all these other countries essentially absorb Palestinians so that the so-called Palestinian problem could cease to be. And everybody's watching now, right? It's not like a protective edge, and it's not like to like cast lead, right? Because people have phones now, people have media now, right? People have access to all kinds of platforms that didn't exist anymore. As big as the Israeli social media operation is, the Arab social media operation is really not that far behind, right? It's still a substantial part of the calculus now in a way that it wasn't before. So there seems to be this growing anxiety, even in American officials. I remember there was this headline where it was something like Tony Blinken visits Netanyahu to essentially show that we have your back fully, Israel. We totally have. We're totally going to support you militarily. We're going to support you diplomatically. And yet, I'm not one of these like body, language freaks. I was just kind of stunned by some of these photos where everybody is just looking so uncomfortable, right? They're looking so nervous. They don't exactly know where this is going to lead. You already start seeing all kinds of overreactions. I'm not sure if pro-Palestine protests are still banned in France, but they were at some point banned in France sometime in the last week. Maybe that was reversed because I keep seeing little stuff popping up. Of course, they didn't ban any pro-Israel protests. You have other countries that essentially banned this sort of pro-Palestinian speech. I've seen, tons of channels get taken down for so-called hate speech. Channels, by the way, which I've never, maybe they did do something bad, but generally speaking, it seemed as if the fact that they were just covering Palestine in such a way, that was enough to be taken down. So we already have the backlash related to COVID. I was not one of these like COVID skeptics. I'm not a vaccine skeptic, right? I'm not anything in that category. I think that's all nonsense. At the same time, I'm able to just objectively recognize that however I personally feel about all that, there was a backlash against any sort of like anti-misinformation campaign. And this is bleeding out now into this campaign that Israel and the EU and America is waging. And you also start noticing all these like weird right-wingers. Like there was this one vaccine disinformation person, like some like female doctor. I don't remember what her name is. And I used to hate follow her, and eventually I unfollowed her. But recently she popped up in my feed and I was just blown away, but she was just like posting tons of like pro-Palestine stuff. You have Andrew Tate, right? And the Tate brothers, they're posting lots of pro-Palestine stuff simply because, they on the one hand, they converted to Islam. I'm not sure how serious they are about it. I'm not sure how much they're just trying to like slice into like a different sort of like audience at this point. I consider both of them like total psychopaths and untrustworthy, right? It's not like I'm celebrating their entry. I'm just making this kind of general observation that we're noticing a kind of real-time shift going on. And it's very different from the kinds of unified statements that the EU, the US, and Israel is making. When it comes to the government, everybody's saying the same exact thing no matter where you look. When you look internally what's going on, right, under the hood, these protests, social media, this sort of body language, something else seems to be happening altogether. I mean, just watch this.
But we're at war. We are at war. We're at war we are defending our homes. We're protecting our homes. That's the truth.
It doesn't seem like he believes that that's the truth. He does seem genuinely nervous. And again, I'm not a body language guy, right? I think most of that is nonsense. But still, I can't help but think watching this that Israel, whether or not it's willing to admit it just yet, I do think, whatever happens to the Palestinian people, whether or not they get absorbed ultimately, I do think in some sort of like cosmic scale, long term, this is the beginning of the end for Israel, not, as a nation state or anything, but just the idea of Israel, the kind of image that it's been cultivating for itself. Eventually, I don't imagine many people would want to live in Israel other than the kind of like totally fanatical, right-wing, religious, anti-cosmopolitan base that seems to be presently cultivated within Israel proper. This has been my reaction to Isaac Herzog. I'm going to have a couple of other videos down the road here. And I'm also going to have something soon. If you guys subscribe, you could actually keep up to date with this and make sure that you see this video. But I want to do a video on Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense in the United States, as well as Colin Powell, right? Because Colin Powell and Lloyd Austin seem to be playing very, very similar roles, right? They're being sent out to defend the indefensible, to put a very nice public face on an indefensible war. It happened in 2003. It's happening again in 2023. I don't think it's a coincidence that in both cases, those that will be thrown under the bus are a tiny bit darker. So thank you guys for watching, and subscribe and like if you want to make sure to get that other upcoming video. Thanks for watching.